Hello, this is Coach Wilson, and this is Unit 5, Day 4. Today's journal, I'd like for you to write down everything you can remember about the Civil War so far. Think about what advantages you think the South might have had, or what advantages or disadvantages the North may have had. Just write down as much as you can. You can also talk about the causes that we've been going over and some different information such as that. Now, today we're going to be talking about the actual war beginning. Obviously, once Abraham Lincoln was elected, the Civil War pretty much was on the rise. Okay, South Carolina seceded along with 6 or 7 other states. Abraham Lincoln made this statement: "A house divided cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure half slave and half free." Now, he makes this statement a little bit later down the line, but this is essentially kind of the aim of the war, which is saving the Union, not freeing the slaves. Now, he eventually is going to realize that, okay, in order for this to be fixed, one has to exist and one cannot. Now, one of the first battles with 7 states seceding, South Carolina began to make a move, and a major Union fort in the South was in Charleston, South Carolina, and the South wanted to take it over. Okay, move the Union out of their basically new country. Union leader Major Robert Anderson fought against Confederacy leader PGT Beauregard, and Beauregard fired on a supply ship that was headed into the fort, and the war started. But after 34 hours, there was no casualty. So even though there was a lot of firing and a lot of fighting, no one actually got hit or died. However, the Union did retreat and leave the fort, and it's considered a Confederate victory, despite the fact that the Union nor the Confederacy lost anyone. Now, here's some pictures of Fort Sumter. Still stands today. You can go check it out. It, along with Fort Fisher, are still there along the coast. Definitely a great tour to go take and just kind of see how they were built. And actually, Fort Fisher is being lost to the ocean a little bit every year, it seems. Now, Lincoln reacted, calling for volunteers to serve in the Union Army. Virginia also seceded, followed by North Carolina, Arkansas, and Tennessee, making 11 total slave states. And then, as we talked about in day 3, the border states, they were controlled by the Union, but they did allow slavery, so that's Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri. And they allowed slavery in these states to keep control of them. So by allowing slavery, they knew they wouldn't rebel, but Lincoln needed to occupy these as a buffer state between the Union and the South. So here is the map of the states that seceded, when they seceded, and then you can see in orange the border states here that are kind of offering a buffer for the Union. All right, now controlling the border was important for Lincoln. It kept the border states as, like I said, a buffer, but he replaced the government officials and even put some of them in jail, suspending habeas corpus, which is basically evidence. He didn't have to have a reason to jail them. And he did this so that he could control those states and make sure that they weren't aiding the South or maybe creating more problems for the Union. Now, the one issue that was problematic is there were Northern Democrats who actually wanted peace with the South, and Union folks, if you want to call them that, called them Copperheads because they didn't believe that we needed to fight each other, that we needed to be supportive of each other and try to help each other. They were given that name because they were easily concealed like a snake, but in both the North and the South, there were groups of people who wanted to just go back to peace. I mean, think about it, guys. You're living in the same country. It's not like, two real factions that form. There's really just one issue that they're fighting over. And you've got one group that is separated and become their own country without, it's not like they polled the whole nation. We're like, hey, would you like to secede? I mean, they just did it. The governments did it. Now, getting into some of the advantages and disadvantages. All right. For the Union, a lot more people, more factories, more railroads, a lot more food production, a very strong central government. They have a lot of advantages here. The problem is a lot of the good generals who are fighting for the U.S. Army are going to go with the secession, and they're going to go into the South. And so that means there's a lot of weak generals. Citizens aren't very well trained in the military because a lot of those were in the South as well. And many citizens disagreed with the war. A lot of those in the North did not agree with a war. However, they wanted slavery gone. In the Confederacy, obviously, a lot of raw materials to sell to other countries, which is income. They also are attractive to alluring other countries to possibly aid them in their fight. Better generals, a stronger military tradition, and they're fighting to defend their homes. The problem is, and this is going to be pretty much what is the huge factor in this war, is they don't have many railroads, very few factories, and a very new, weak government that doesn't have a lot of stability. Now, This comparison chart shows just some different things between the two sides. Like pig iron, which they're going to use for bullet making and gun making and things of that nature. Look at the ratio there. 20-1 is huge. 32-1 on firearms and guns. 70-30 on railroads. 17-1 in textiles that are being developed. 110,000 factories to 18,000 in the South. I mean, there's just the numbers alone for the North are astronomical in comparison to the South. And then you add in the railroads and the fact that they had the infrastructure to support their battle lines in the North versus in the South. There's not a lot of connections there. That's going to be the deciding factor in the war. Now, leaders, Abraham Lincoln is going to be president with his vice president Hannibal Hamlin. Of the Confederacy, President Jefferson Davis with Alexander Stephens as his VP. And then we're just going to look at some of the generals for the Union. Joseph Hooker, Winfield Scott, Irwin McDowell, George McClellan, Burnside, who is by far one of the most interesting looking characters, George Meade, and then Ulysses S. Grant. And it's important to note that Lincoln is going to go through generals very quickly because they're going to lose battles and not be successful, and he's going to change his leadership constantly until he finds somebody that can lead. Now, for the Confederate side, you have Stonewall Jackson, George Pickett, James Longstreet, Nathan Bedford Forrest, which, for the record, if you've ever seen Forrest Gump, at the very beginning he talks about Nathan Bedford Forrest. That's who he's talking about. Jeb Stuart, and then finally, one of the greatest generals of the Confederacy, Robert E. Lee. Now, one quick note, Robert E. Lee actually had thought about fighting for the Union before this war started. He was kind of he would serve in the U.S. military. He had served in the Union Army, but for him, he could not fight against his home state of Virginia. The war ends up being one of attrition, meaning that the one that could last the longest was going to win. And in this case, whoever could make the most stuff was going to win. One of the other things that happens during this time is that the Confederate capital was in Montgomery, Alabama, at the very beginning of this when they seceded, and then they moved it to Richmond, Virginia, because now it could appear that the Confederacy had a legitimate claim that if they could win the war, they could be the new government in place. They were 100 miles away from each other, and there's obviously a lot of parity there on purpose. Now, Lincoln's goal and his strategy was called the Anaconda Plan, and it was a three-pronged attack. First of all, he wanted to blockade the South, make it to where they can't get supplies from the ocean or sea and from any allies. Then divide the Confederacy into two parts. And then finally, take the capital of the Confederacy in Richmond, Virginia. And essentially what you're going to do is coil around them like a snake and then kind of choke them out as pictured here. Now, this was Winfield Scott's plan, and this plan is going to be kind of how we start the war, and it's going to be the basis of Lincoln's goals throughout the war is trying to surround the South and cut them off from everything and basically leave them dry. So that's all we're going to talk about today. We'll pick more up with the Civil War in our next day of notes. Make sure you answer your questions, and then here are your 4 vocabulary words. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, I'll talk to you soon.